And joining us today is David Stilwell. He's the former Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He also served in the Air Force for 35 years, including as the defense attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And he's also been the director of the China Strategic Focus Group at U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So David, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. I'm a big admirer of your work.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I liked a lot of how the U.S.-China policy changed when you were the Assistant Secretary of State. Actually, one thing I want to ask about is when you were in that position, you talked a lot about the idea of reciprocity. What does that mean?
Well, I'm a career military guy and didn't know anything about diplomacy until I went to Bolling Air Force Base in Maryland, where they hold the Joint Military Attaché School. And what they told me is that, in your past life, your weapons were bullets and bombs and things that blow up. In your new life as a diplomat, you have two weapons, and those are whiskey and words. And the only way you can get the other side to, live up to its commitments and to treat you with respect is through transactional reciprocal treatment. If you deny me this, I deny you that. This is the fundamental basis of diplomacy.
What about honey traps?
That's a different animal. Let's talk about white world diplomacy, not the rest of that. If our diplomats are being treated badly in China, then we should, in theory, return the favor, but we haven't. We've always made excuses to say, if you treat China like an enemy, they'll become one. I mean, all these just trite, unthought, aphorisms. So,
well, we know that doesn't work because China has treated us like an enemy, and we haven't become one.
They call us the enemy. They openly call us, in amongst themselves, the enemy. And so one of the things we want to do is just simply get away from that idea that we need to cooperate more, and we need to meet them where they're at, and we did to some effect. That it needed a little more time to come to complete fruition. But I do think we made some ground. I defer to you. You probably know better. You're more objective than I am.
Well, I'm curious what you saw. Where do you think the idea that we can't treat China as an enemy or they'll become an enemy, where'd that obviously bogus notion come from? Why was it so entrenched for so long?
There's a long list, and I don't want to embarrass anyone, but there's just a long list of people who take a one-sided view to this, and what worked in Europe they thought would work in elsewhere. The other part of that, though, is what we're seeing today in academia and other places, is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology story, so many people went down record early on saying it couldn't possibly have been the virology lab, that they risk embarrassment by reversing themselves. No one wants to admit they were wrong, right? Because your credibility in the future suffers. And I think that's also the case, And there is so much hope with all these discussions and conversations and dialogues that we had, SNED, DNSD, alphabet soup, hundreds. I think there were 150 different dialogues like that. Produced nothing, but nobody wanted to admit it because they had hung their reputation, their credibility on the fact that I'm having these meetings with China.
You're talking about dialogues between the U.S. government and the Chinese government?
Official, track one.
Mm-hmm.
So how did China responded to you talking about this reciprocity?
Well, you saw the Global Times and others, both professional and personal attacks on that. I do say, though, that, one of my mottos was we have to speak to them in a language they understand. I think for the longest time, they were wondering when we would actually wake up. There was some confusion as to what are the Americans doing. There was this, I think, a fear that there was something happening below the waterline they weren't aware of, which was the only explanation for the Americans continuing to give away the store the way they were. So I would say some confusion, but in some ways there was also a sense of relief that, okay, now we're actually having a conversation on a level field that we both understand. The dialogue, it didn't open up. But the fact is that we didn't keep coming to them, begging them to talk to us and asking to be nice to us. We basically said, we have an issue here. We have offered to talk. You haven't taken it seriously. So we're just going to wait patiently until you are ready to talk. And when you are, we'll be happy to come have a conversation. And those two opportunities happened in August of 2019 and June of 2020, when Yang Jiechi came to the U.S. to meet, officially with Secretary of State Pompeo. And that was just us, being patient and waiting for them until they reached a point where they're ready to talk.
Boy, I'm now thinking about some more recent U.S.-China meetings with Yang Jiechi. It didn't quite go so well.
The Alaska meeting?
I'm thinking that, yeah.
I'm not going to be critical of the current folks. They're going about it in a way they think is right. And if you've seen, they have continued the Trump administration policies almost verbatim. So they see the value in that, and they are executing it, I think, in a way they find helpful to themselves. And there's a learning curve there. So I'll just leave it at that. But here's the deal. You can't want dialogue too much. If the other side doesn't want it, it's like anything. Like when I went to Beijing as defense attaché, I went during the ardent suitor period, where I'm the high school pimply-faced nerd trying to get the beautiful cheerleader to go out with me. And so I'm endlessly saying, oh, please, 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 offering gifts, anything to talk to me. And what's her incentive to do that? Nothing. So we played ardent suitor for a long time, and then finally said, you know what, this doesn't work. I gave a speech at CSIS in December of 19 on this topic. It was about 40 years of trying to win China over. If we'd quit too soon, we'd have been justifiably self-critical of maybe not giving it enough try. 40 years of trying, I think, was sufficient. And nobody could blame us of being, hair trigger on this, of going too soon. I think the previous administrations, rightfully, I was part of that, said we need to give them every opportunity, and we need to get at the other voices and factions maybe inside China who understand the benefit of having these cooperative sort of engagements. But after 40 years, it was time to throw up our hands and say, they don't want it. They're not going to, no matter how much we beg, they're not going to join us. So now we're going to meet them where they are. And that's where we're at now.
Well, did you have a moment that changed your mind about how the U.S. was approaching China?
I did. When I was a defense attaché, not knowing any better, I went to the PRC, and my folks told me that we really have no way of, like emergency hotline phone calls. We don't have a phone number. They're very protective of being seen, perhaps as, traitorous activity of having these private conversations with the Americans. So they don't have no conversation at all. And some of my subordinates did have maybe some contact with their partners, but I personally, as a defense attaché, had no direct contact with anybody on the Chinese side. All communications happened via fax.
In Beijing, you had to fax them?
I had a fax number, and then if there was a request for a delegation or support or démarche, that was done by fax, again, at my level. So I was in DC talking to my counterpart, a guy named Xu Nangfeng, and I said, how's it work for you? He goes, and he would, and I knew he was making calls to anybody in the U.S. government or in PACOM or anywhere, setting up lunches, having conversations. So I said, how is this fair in terms of reciprocity and otherwise? How is it fair that I am cut off completely and you have full access? And he kind of smirked. He didn't smile. He kind of grinned, and he goes, well, it's not our system. Our system doesn't allow us to give you full access to us. Your system allows us that. And of course, we're going to take advantage of that. So that was the beginning of understanding just how out of balance this relationship was and how necessary it was to insist that, they talk about mutual benefit, mutual respect, and win-win outcomes in this Xinxing Daguo Guanxi, the new type great power competition. So I'm just holding them to that. Mutual respect means I have the same contact that you do. Mutual benefit means we can have a conversation as needed.
There's been a lot of criticism of reciprocity, as in, well, shouldn't the U.S. be taking the high road, just because the Chinese government is petty about certain things, or, shouldn't the U.S. be treating them better because we have the better system, we should be treating them better, or, things like, if you do this, then you're actually limiting U.S. access to China in an unhelpful way, like getting our U.S. media kicked out of China. What would you say to that?
I say we tried all that stuff. Yeah. Einstein says what insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different outcome. We tried it. We tried everything, and eventually you have to go with what works. And when all else fails, you're reduced level by level by level to the most basic. And the most basic is you get one reporter, we get one reporter. You get one reporter, like that. So as far as media being kicked out, we didn't kick them out. We actually took a very, I think, a benevolent approach in simply naming organizations whose job was to transmit to American people messages from the Chinese government. That's a foreign mission. That is not a legitimate media outlet, right? Xinhua, CCTV, CGTN, and the rest. And just identifying from what they really are is, they're mouthpieces of the Chinese government. One of the questions I asked is, show me a single byline from your Xinhua reporters here. Show me a single byline back in Beijing that reports on what's going on in the U.S. And you can't show me any, because remember, their job is to take information from Beijing propaganda department and funnel it into the American media for American people to digest, quite effectively, by the way. The China daily inserts and all that stuff, people unconsciously or sometimes consciously repeat back the propaganda lines on that. So yes, we would love to operate in a much higher plane, but we're not allowed to do that. Finally, we did remove 60 journalists, so-called journalists, back, I think March, April of last year. And they, of course, responded by decrementing our 50 down to 30 or whatever it was. The way this was going to end up is it was going to go to zero. And then, like I said, we were going to go back to true reciprocity. You let one American in, we'll let a Chinese reporter in, like that, and build it back up, because it's already out of whack, right? There's no way we're going to win this decrement war, because we get to zero well before they did. So, eventually we're just have to start from scratch.